had always thought of that house as my anchor. 40 years of mornings and evenings, of worn kitchen tiles under my bare feet, of roses that knew my hands better than I knew my own reflection. That morning, when I pulled into the driveway after a quiet weekend away, the first thing I noticed wasn't the house at all. It was the mess in front of it. My roses were trampled. My potted lilies lay smashed in the driveway like fallen china. And in the center of it all, piled high and careless, were my clothes, photo albums, and my late husband's fishing rod. For a moment, my mind refused to place these things in reality. Surely this was a mistake. Surely they hadn't done this. But then I saw the note, taped to the front door, fluttering in the warm wind like a flag I didn't want to salute. Sorry, Mom. My wife's parents are moving in with us. There's no room for you anymore. I hope you understand. His handwriting hadn't changed. Neat, careful, the way it had been on his school essays I once proofread at the kitchen table. My knees nearly gave way. I gripped the car door to steady myself. Across the street, neighbors stood frozen, their curiosity and pity heavy in the air. I knocked on the door once, then again, harder. When it opened just a crack, my son's eyes avoided mine. His voice was low, almost embarrassed. Mom, it's better this way. Behind him she appeared, arms folded, a smirk playing at her lips. You've had your time here. We need the space. My parents deserve comfort in their old age. I felt my breath catch in my throat. The door closed. The lock clicked. I stood there in the June heat, my hands shaking as they held that single sheet of paper. And I understood, in a way I had never understood before. Sometimes the ground doesn't give you warning before it disappears beneath you. I don't remember the exact moment my feet began to move. One moment I was standing on that porch with the note in my hand. The next I was walking away, suitcase in one hand, my late husband's fishing rod in the other, as if carrying it might keep some part of my life intact. The suitcase was small. Too small for a life lived over 70 years. It held only what I'd taken with me for the weekend. A change of clothes, a worn sweater, my toiletries. Everything else, my books, my kitchenware, the quilt my mother made when I was a girl, was sitting out there in the open air, baking in the sun, waiting to be scavenged or ruined. I walked slowly, not because I was tired, but because I didn't know where to go. The neighborhood looked different now. The houses I'd waved to for decades seemed foreign, their windows like blank eyes pretending not to see. Riverside Park was only 3 blocks away. My husband and I had walked there nearly every evening after dinner in the early years, back when the world still felt full of small, ordinary joys. I found the same green bench at the edge of the pond, its paint peeling, one leg still uneven from the time my grandson had rocked it too hard when he was little. I sat there with my suitcase by my side, hands folded on my lap, and let the weight of the day settle over me. Around me the world was moving, oblivious. Children ran past chasing a deflated soccer ball. An old man tossed breadcrumbs to pigeons, the crumbs scattering like pale confetti. A young couple argued in hushed tones over a spilled coffee. Life didn't pause to acknowledge my collapse. I looked down at my hands, veined now, skin thinning, but still the same hands that once planted the roses now crushed in my driveway. The same hands that kneaded bread every Sunday morning so the smell would greet my son as he came down the stairs. Hands that once held his fevered head through long, anxious nights. Those memories used to warm me. Today they burned. I tried to remember the last time I had asked my son for anything. Couldn't. I had given so much of myself to him and his family that I'd forgotten what it felt like to be on the receiving end of kindness. I'd declined trips with friends so I could babysit their son. I'd handed over parts of my savings to help when his business was going through a rough patch. I'd stayed home for birthdays I wasn't invited to, because they told me it would be less crowded this way. And in return, I had been given an eviction notice disguised as an apology. I sat until the sun slipped behind the trees, my shadow stretching long across the path. The note was still in my pocket, folded neatly, as if handling it gently might turn it into something else, something less cruel. But paper can't be softened, not once the words are written. When the street lamps flickered on, I finally stood, my knees protesting the movement. I still didn't know where I was going. But I knew one thing: wherever I ended up, it would not be under their roof again. Not because I had nowhere else to go, but because they had shown me the truth. Some people will take everything you give them, and when you have nothing left to offer, they will take the roof over your head too. The park had emptied by the time I began to feel the air change. It wasn't colder, just thinner, like the kind of breeze that slips under doors and makes you check if the windows are shut. I sat there, suitcase by my feet, and let it pass through me, carrying with it fragments of the past I had never meant to revisit. They came in no particular order. Half-formed moments, sharp-edged sentences that I had once brushed off as nothing. I remembered the first Thanksgiving after my son married her. My table, always full of warm chaos and mismatched chairs, was suddenly curated. Emily, always just trying to make things modern, had suggested we move dinner to her place so it would feel more elevated. I went along with it, thinking it was just enthusiasm. But when I arrived, my pies were still in their foil trays in the kitchen, never brought to the table. I remembered her voice when she thought I wasn't listening, the way it would flatten. "He gets too many sweets over there," she'd say about my grandson. Or, "She's a bit old-fashioned with her decor." Always said as if I were a quaint inconvenience, something to be tolerated, not treasured. There was the time a few years ago when they joked at a family barbecue about how cozy it would be if her parents moved in someday. "We'd all just have to squeeze," she laughed, eyes glinting. I laughed too because I thought it was a joke. And then there was the gardening shed. "My sanctuary," she once said to me, smiling. "When we finally make this house ours, I'm turning that into a spa room." I'd thought she was being playful. Now, sitting on that bench, I could hear the truth under her voice. A truth that had been there all along. My son, my boy who used to run to me with scraped knees and muddy shoes, had been slipping away in increments. First it was just fewer phone calls. Then advice replaced with requests for money. Each, "Thank you, Mom," sounding more like a closing line in a business email. I had thought I was keeping the family together by giving, by smoothing every rough edge, by staying quiet when something stung. But silence doesn't keep people close. It only teaches them how far they can go without being stopped. Somewhere in the dark, a street lamp clicked on, spilling a small pool of light onto my lap. I looked at my hands again, those same tired hands, and realized they had been holding the rope for years, keeping it taut while the other end slipped from my son's grasp. And now, finally, I could feel it. The rope was gone. They had let go first. I reached into my pocket and touched the folded note again. Not to reread it, there was no need, but to feel the paper and remind myself that the worst had already happened. The wind shifted again, carrying the faint scent of lilacs from the far side of the park. My husband once told me that scent was a sign of change, a sign to pay attention. I didn't know yet what I was going to do. But I knew one thing with a clarity that felt almost like peace. This was not an ending I would accept. The morning after I slept on that bench, I found myself walking without thinking, my suitcase bumping softly against my leg. I hadn't eaten, but I wasn't hungry. Hunger seemed like a smaller ache now, lost under the larger one. It was the smell that drew me in, a faint trace of burnt coffee and warm cinnamon. A small diner, tucked between a laundromat and a shuttered florist. I slid into a corner booth by the window and wrapped my hands around a chipped mug the waitress set down in front of me. I was staring through the glass when a voice pulled me back. "Martha." I turned and there she was, Janet, an old friend from the neighborhood committee, holding a paper bag that smelled suspiciously like fresh cinnamon rolls. She looked surprised, but her surprise quickly softened into something else. She slid into the booth without waiting for an invitation. "Are you all right?" I didn't answer right away. My voice still felt caught somewhere between my chest and my throat. Janet reached across the table, her hand covering mine. The warmth of it almost undid me. I fought the sting in my eyes. "They kicked you out, didn't they?" she asked low, as if speaking too loudly might make the truth sharper. I looked at her, startled. "I wasn't going to say anything," she continued, leaning in. "But I overheard Emily at the farmer's market a few weeks ago. She was telling someone they were planning to sell the house once you were out of the way. She said it so casually, like it was already decided. The words landed heavy, but there was no shock left in me. Only confirmation. She even said, Janet went on, that the money would go toward paying her parents' debts. That you were too trusting to see it coming. Too trusting. I let the phrase sit in my mind like a stone at the bottom of a well. I thought of all the times I'd defended Emily to friends who didn't like her sharpness. All the times I told myself she was just under stress, just trying to make a place for herself in the family. But people don't talk about your future like that unless they already think it's theirs. I stared down at my hands again, but they didn't look like they did yesterday. They weren't trembling now. They were steady. Janet squeezed my hand again. I'm sorry, she said. I lifted my eyes to hers. Don't be, I said. You didn't do this. Outside, someone walked past the window, their reflection sliding briefly over mine. I didn't look like the woman I had been 2 days ago, and maybe that was a good thing. Janet left after a while, pressing the bag of cinnamon rolls into my hands like a peace offering I didn't know I needed. I sat there long after she was gone, the tea in my cup growing cold, watching the quiet rhythm of people outside who had no idea my life had been stripped bare. When I finally stood to leave, I almost turned toward the park again. But something in me resisted the idea of returning to that bench. I didn't want to sit anymore. I wanted to move, even if I didn't yet know toward what. My fingers, restless, searched through my purse for no reason. That's when I felt it. A small, cool piece of metal at the very bottom, wrapped in a scrap of paper towel like a secret. Not to the house I'd been pushed out of. To another place. It had been years since I thought of it. A narrow studio above an old brick building downtown. I'd been given access to it decades ago, back when I worked part-time at the Community Arts Center. The director had offered it as part of a staff housing program, and though I never truly moved in, I paid the minimal rent each year, keeping it as a sort of safety net. I told myself it was just practical, but maybe some part of me had always known. The key was tarnished, the ridges worn smooth from time. It didn't gleam. It didn't pretend to be anything other than what it was. Functional, enduring. I tightened my grip around it and began walking. The streets changed as I moved further downtown. Wide, tree-lined avenues giving way to narrower roads with faded shop signs and windows dressed in dust. When I reached the building, it was exactly as I remembered. Red brick, tall windows smudged by years of rain, a faint smell of old paper and paint lingering even from the sidewalk. The stairwell creaked under my weight as I climbed to the 3rd floor. The lock resisted for a moment, as if testing me. Then, with a reluctant click, it turned. The air inside was cool and faintly musty. A small bed tucked in the corner, a 2-burner stove, a chipped sink, a single armchair with worn arms. The window was narrow but let in just enough light to touch the floorboards. I set my suitcase down in the middle of the room and just stood there. It wasn't much, but it was mine. And no one could tape a note to its door without going through me first. I walked to the window and looked out at the alley below, lined with fire escapes and laundry lines swaying gently in the breeze. The hum of the city was distant but steady, like a heartbeat I could match my own to. For the first time since that note appeared on my door, I let my shoulders drop. I was safe. Not forever, not yet, but for tonight. And maybe tonight was enough. The studio was quiet in a way my old house had never been. No refrigerator hum from an overstocked kitchen. No television murmuring in the next room. No footsteps overhead. Just the faint tick of the old wall clock and the muffled city sounds filtering in through the window. I set the kettle on the 2-burner stove. The handle was warm to the touch, polished smooth by years of use. When I turned the knob, the blue flame lit with a small, steady sigh, as if even the stove was relieved to be useful again. As the water heated, I moved slowly through the room. I opened the narrow wardrobe, empty save for a single wire hanger. The top drawer of the small dresser still held a faded tea towel I'd left here years ago. In the cabinet above the sink, a chipped white mug waited, patient as a loyal friend. I thought about the last 24 hours, About the way life can collapse without so much as a warning crack. One morning you think you have a home, a place to return to. By nightfall, you're standing on a sidewalk with your life reduced to a suitcase and whatever you can carry in your hands. But here, this place had waited for me. Quietly. Without demands. Without judgment. The kettle began to whistle, sharp but not urgent. I poured the water over the tea leaves, watching the steam rise and curl in the cool air. As I held the mug between my palms, I heard my husband's voice in my memory. Not in any particular moment, but in the way certain truths settle deep enough to last years. Quiet doesn't mean weak, Martha. Sometimes quiet is how you gather your strength. Took a long sip. The jasmine was faint, but still there, a ghost of its original fragrance. I sat at the small table with the mug and a scrap of paper from the dresser drawer. I began to list the things I still had. Documents, records, old contacts. People who had once owed me favors. Names of those who knew the history of the house better than my son ever bothered to learn. Each name was a stitch, pulling something together inside me. Not anger exactly, but focus. I wasn't going to knock on their door and beg for a place in my own home. I wasn't going to shout or cry, or try to make them see what they had done. I was going to take back what was mine. Quietly. Completely. The call came 2 days later, just after the morning light had begun to stretch across the studio floor. My phone lit up with my son's name. For a moment I let it ring. I watched the screen as though it were something distant, unrelated to me. But then I pressed answer. "Mom," he began quickly. His voice pitched in a way that tried to sound concerned. "Where are you? We've been worried." Worried. The word felt absurd in my ear, like someone offering you an umbrella after they've burned down your house. "I'm fine," I said flatly. I could picture him now, standing in their kitchen, running a hand through his hair the way he always did when he was about to lie. "I think we all got a bit heated," he said. "We didn't mean for things to go so far. Can we meet? Just to talk?" I agreed. Not because I wanted reconciliation, but because I wanted to see his face when he realized I wasn't coming back. We chose a small diner downtown, the same one where Janet had told me the truth. I arrived early, taking a booth by the window. The waitress set down a cup of tea, steam curling in the cool air. I held it between my palms, letting the heat seep into my fingers. They arrived together. He looked thinner, more tired, like someone who had been sleeping with one eye open. She was as composed as ever. Hair sleek, lipstick immaculate, wearing that particular shade of beige that expensive people wear to look effortless. They slid into the booth across from me. My son reached across the table for my hand. I kept mine folded in my lap. His eyes flickered. "Mom, we wanted to apologize," he began. "It was a misunderstanding, really. We just thought it would be easier if—" "Easier for who?" I asked quietly. The question hung between us like a blade. He glanced at her. She took over, her voice smooth, each word dipped in artificial sweetness. "We've been under a lot of stress. My parents, well, they have nowhere else to go. And since you're so independent, we thought maybe you wouldn't mind staying somewhere else for a while." Her hand slipped into her bag and returned with a thick envelope. She placed it on the table between us as though it were a gift. "These are some final property transfer papers," she said, smiling as if we were discussing flowers for a garden party. "It would just make everything cleaner, legally speaking. We could all move forward. As a family." I didn't touch the envelope. I only looked at it for a long moment, then pushed it gently back toward her with the tips of my fingers. "I'll think about it," I said evenly. Her smile tightened, her eyes narrowing just slightly at the edges. "Of course. We knew you'd be reasonable." My son finally looked up at me, then really looked. There was a flicker of something there. Confusion, maybe fear, but it passed quickly. I finished my tea without another word, stood, and stepped away from the table. As I reached the door, I heard her voice, low and sharp. What did she mean she'll think about it? She's supposed to sign today. The bell above the door chimed as I left. The cool air outside met my face, And I realized something I hadn't fully felt until that moment. I didn't need to win an argument with them. I had already won by refusing to play it. By the time I climbed the stairs to the studio, the street outside was already settling into evening. The narrow hallway smelled faintly of dust and paint thinner, a scent I was beginning to find oddly comforting. I closed the door behind me, locking it with deliberate care. The silence inside met me like a blanket, thin, but enough to keep out the chill of their voices. On the small table by the bed sat the photo album I had salvaged from the lawn the day they pushed me out. I had placed it there 2 nights ago and hadn't dared open it since. It had felt too fragile, as if touching it would split me open. But tonight was different. I carried it to the table by the window, where the last of the day's light spilled in, turning the dust in the air into slow-moving stars. The cover was scuffed, the edges fraying from years of use. I opened it carefully, page by page. There was my husband standing in the backyard, holding up a basket of tomatoes we'd grown together in our first summer there. His smile was easy, his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow. I could almost smell the soil on his hands. There was my grandson, no more than 5, holding a sparkler on a July night, the golden light catching the wonder in his eyes. And there was my son, laughing, leaning against the kitchen counter with a mug of coffee, long before the distance settled between us. Once, these images would have made my chest ache with longing. They would have pulled me backward, into rooms and conversations I could no longer enter. But tonight I saw them differently. They were whole moments, already lived, already complete. They didn't belong to the people my son and his wife had become. They belonged to the woman I had been. And she was still here, sitting at this table, turning these pages. The hurt had loosened its grip. The pictures didn't demand I return to them. They allowed me to remember without needing to relive. I closed the album gently and set it aside. The kettle began to hiss on the stove. I made myself another cup of tea and sat in the armchair, the steam rising like breath in the cool air. Outside, the city lights flickered on one by one. Somewhere below, a radio played an old song I used to hum while kneading bread. I let it wash over me. And for the first time since that note on the door, I realized I wasn't mourning anymore. I was taking inventory. The next morning I woke before the sun. The city outside was still muted, the air holding that strange blue stillness that comes just before the day starts moving. I dressed with purpose, sliding my documents into the worn manila folder I'd found in the studio's dresser. By the time I reached Richard's office, the streets were filling with commuters, their faces set in that same blend of hurry and distraction. I wondered if any of them had ever had to take their life back piece by piece, in full view of the world, without anyone noticing. Richard greeted me at the door, ushering me into his office lined with shelves of leather-bound law books. His desk was already clear, a legal pad waiting in the center. We spread out my papers, old tax records, property deeds, letters from the bank. He examined each one with the quiet efficiency of a man who knew time was both our ally and our enemy. "They can't sell the house without your signature," he said at last, tapping the deed with his pen. "And they've already overstepped by trying to push these transfer papers at you." I nodded, my hands steady. "Then we close every door they could use." He began drafting the documents. An injunction to block any sale or transfer, a formal revocation of any prior authorizations, a freeze on joint accounts. The language was cold, precise, without space for sentiment. I read every line before signing, my pen moving slowly but without hesitation. The ink bled into the paper, each stroke a severing of some invisible tether. When we finished, Richard looked at me over the rims of his glasses. "You realize they'll come for you harder now." "Let them," I said. "They've already taken everything they could. Now it's my turn." I gathered the signed pages into the folder and closed it with care. Some papers build a life. Some protect it. And some cut clean through the bonds you never thought you'd have to break. 3 days later, my phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize. I let it go to voicemail. When I listened, the voice was tight, controlled, but fraying at the edges. "Emily." "Martha, hi. There seems to be some kind of issue with the house paperwork. The bank says there's a hold on certain transactions, and they won't explain why. Could you call me back so we can straighten it out? I didn't call back. That afternoon Richard sent me an update. The injunction had gone through faster than expected. The bank had confirmed all freezes. Any attempt to refinance, sell, or borrow against the property would now require my signed approval. Approval I had no intention of giving. For the first time in weeks, I slept through the night without waking in that cold, jolting way, as though falling from a height. 2 mornings later I passed by their street. Not to look at the house but because it was the shortest route to the market. Still I noticed the difference. The blinds were drawn tight in the middle of the day. The driveway, usually crowded with their cars, was empty except for one. From across the road I saw my son step outside. He glanced around, scanning the street like someone expecting a delivery that would never come. His phone was pressed to his ear, his voice low and tense. Kept walking. I didn't wave. It occurred to me then that the power they thought they held over me had never been real. It had only been my willingness to cooperate. And now that willingness was gone. The door had closed. Not behind me but in front of them. And I was the one who held the key. The news came to me not from Richard, not from the bank, but from Janet. I was in the little diner again, sipping tea at my usual corner table, when she walked in and sat down without asking. "They're furious," she said in a low voice, leaning forward as if she were telling me about a storm heading for the coast. "I overheard Emily at the post office this morning. She was on the phone, practically hissing. Something about everything being frozen and Martha's stubbornness ruining everything." I stirred my tea slowly. The clink of the spoon against the porcelain felt like a punctuation mark I'd been waiting to write for years. Janet went on. She mentioned their plans for the second mortgage falling apart. I think she said something about having to postpone a trip. Sounded expensive. Very expensive. I let her words sink in, not rushing to respond. Outside, a city bus hissed to a stop, people spilling onto the sidewalk with the weary gait of late afternoon. "They thought you wouldn't fight," Janet said. "They were right," I replied, finally looking up at her. "I'm not fighting. I'm reclaiming." After she left, I stayed a while longer, the empty mug warm against my palms. I thought about the way victory is so often portrayed. Loud, triumphant, full of cheering. But there's another kind of victory, one that slips in quietly, without spectacle, and settles into your bones. That night in the studio, I pulled the manila folder from the dresser and laid everything out on the table. Copies of the injunction, the deed, the bank confirmations. One by one, I touched each page, feeling the weight of what they represented. Not just property or legal standing, but proof that I could still shape the ground under my feet. I thought of my husband, of the long years we'd built that home together, never imagining it would become a battlefield. Of the late nights at the kitchen table when he'd remind me to keep records of everything, just in case. This was the case. I lit the small lamp in the corner and worked until midnight, sorting documents into a neat stack. Outside, the alley was quiet, the laundry lines swaying in the faint breeze. Somewhere in the distance, a train rumbled past, its sound fading into the dark. It was then I realized, there was no anger in me, no heat, only a deep, steady calm. They could rant, they could scramble, they could try every trick in their book. But I had already stepped out of their reach. And in that quiet, I understood the truth. They might never knock on my door again. And I would be perfectly fine if they didn't. The letter from Richard arrived on a gray morning, slipped under my studio door with a faint smell of rain clinging to the envelope. I knew before I opened it that it was the end of this chapter. Inside was a single sheet, formal, stamped, and utterly final. The property was now fully and solely in my name. No co-signers. No shared ownership. Every thread they had tried to weave into my life had been cut, clean and irreversible. I sat at the table for a long time, running my fingertips over the embossed seal. It wasn't the paper itself that mattered. It was the fact that I had walked through fire to hold it. For weeks, I had been living in quiet, deliberate motion, visiting Richard's office, answering no calls I didn't want to, walking through the city without glancing over my shoulder. In that time, something in me had shifted. I was no longer the woman standing on a porch holding a note in the heat of June. I was someone who could lock her own door and know that no one had the right to open it but her. That afternoon I went back to the house. Not to reclaim it, it was already mine, but to decide what would happen next. The garden was overgrown, roses bending under their own weight. The blinds were drawn. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air was still, carrying a faint scent of dust and something metallic. The furniture sat exactly as I remembered, but it felt staged now, as if waiting for strangers to walk through during an open house. My footsteps echoed differently on the hardwood floors. I moved slowly through the rooms, touching nothing, just letting my eyes travel over the spaces I had once known so well. The kitchen where I had taught my son to make pancakes. The hallway where my grandson's drawings had once been taped in bright, uneven rows. None of it hurt anymore. It was like walking through a photograph, something beautiful but finished. I went upstairs to the bedroom, opened the top drawer of the old dresser, and found the silk scarf my husband had given me one winter. I wrapped it around my neck, not for the chill, but for the comfort of knowing it was mine, untouched by their hands. When I left, I locked the door with steady fingers and placed the key in my pocket. The future of the house, whether I sold it, rented it, or simply let it stand empty, would be decided by me and me alone. Back in the studio that evening, I pulled out a fresh notebook and wrote my name on the first page in bold, deliberate letters. Martha Ellison. No mom. No mother-in-law. No title that tied me to anyone else's claim. Just my own name, whole and unqualified. The city outside my window was alive. Distant horns, voices drifting up from the street, the low hum of neon signs flickering to life. I brewed a pot of tea, set it beside me, and picked up the quilt I had been stitching in the quiet hours of these last weeks. Each piece of fabric was different. Some bright, some muted, some rough to the touch. Together they made something strong, something warm. Like me. Somewhere across town, they might have been sitting in a darkened room, whispering about what went wrong, replaying each moment they thought they had control. But those conversations were no longer mine to imagine. The part of me that once lived for their approval was gone, and in its place was something quieter, steadier. As I set the last stitch in place, I realized the truth. They hadn't just given me back my house. They had given me back myself. And this time I was keeping both.